The seeker stands before an ancient threshold, confronted by a question that has haunted humanity since consciousness first turned inward upon itself. What is the authentic structure of human transformation? This question, far from being a relic of bygone mysticism, represents a fundamental philosophical problem for the modern individual navigating an age of fragmented meaning and hollow spirituality. The concept of trinosophy, the threefold wisdom, emerges not as a mere historical curiosity, but as a rigorous map of consciousness, a systematic architecture for understanding the psychological and spiritual dimensions of human becoming. The historical lineage of this threefold structure extends deep into the Western esoteric tradition. The Hermetic corpus, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, established the foundational principle that reality operates according to triadic structures, the three parts of wisdom encompassing alchemy, astrology, and theurgy. Paracelsus, the 16th century physician-philosopher, reformulated this wisdom into the doctrine of the tria prima, salt, sulfur, and mercury, representing body, soul, and spirit respectively. These were not material substances, but philosophical principles, symbolic coordinates for mapping the terrain of human existence. This triadic framework reappears with striking consistency across traditions. The Rosicrucian manifestos spoke of a threefold reformation of knowledge, religion, and society. Eliphas Levi, in his 19th century revival of magical philosophy, insisted that the great work required the integration of three powers: will, knowledge, and courage. Carl Jung, translating these esoteric systems into psychological language, identified the process of individuation as requiring the integration of ego, shadow, and self, another triadic structure underlying authentic transformation. The true secret of trinosophy lies in understanding that these are not external doctrines to be believed, but internal structures to be experienced. The threefold wisdom represents the minimal necessary complexity for genuine psychological transformation. Any system with fewer than three elements collapses into dualism, the sterile opposition of light and dark, good and evil, conscious and unconscious. Any system with more than three primary elements risks dispersing focus and diluting the intensity required for authentic change. The triad represents the precise architecture through which consciousness must navigate to achieve integration. This is the premise upon which the Hermetic school builds its instruction. The authentic mystery is not concealed in obscure texts or secret societies, but within the structure of consciousness itself. The work is internal, psychological, and spiritual, a disciplined engagement with the threefold nature of human being. The seeker who approaches this work casually, seeking novelty or exotic experience, will find nothing but confusion. Only those who approach with philosophical rigor and psychological honesty will discover the operational power of the threefold wisdom. The central system of trinosophy rests upon the recognition that human consciousness operates according to three fundamental principles, three modes of being that must be understood, differentiated, and ultimately integrated. These principles appear under various names across traditions, but their essential structure remains constant. In alchemical language, salt, sulfur, and mercury. In Rosicrucian terminology, corpus, anima, spiritus. In psychological terms, body, soul, and spirit. Salt represents the principle of fixation, materiality, and resistance. It is the dense, earthly aspect of human existence, the physical body, the conditioning of habit, the weight of personal history. Salt is what grounds consciousness in time and space, what gives individual identity its particular contours and limitations. Philosophically, salt corresponds to the realm of necessity, the deterministic aspects of existence that constrain and define. It is the crystallized residue of experience, the accumulated karma of past choices now solidified into character structure. Sulfur embodies the principle of combustion, desire, and transformation. It represents the volatile, passionate dimension of human nature, the soul's longing, the fire of emotion, the drive toward meaning and connection. Sulfur is the animating force that prevents life from becoming mere mechanical repetition. In philosophical terms, it corresponds to the realm of possibility, the dynamic potential that strains against the limits imposed by salt. Sulfur is inherently unstable, seeking always to break free from fixed forms, to consume and transform whatever it touches. Mercury signifies the principle of mediation, fluidity, and consciousness itself. It is the subtle reflective capacity that can move between salt and sulfur, between body and soul, between matter and spirit. Mercury represents the function of awareness, the capacity to observe and integrate the other two principles. Philosophically, Mercury corresponds to the realm of actuality, not mere possibility nor fixed necessity, but the living present in which consciousness operates. Mercury is the alchemist within, the transformative agent that can convert base material into gold. The interconnection among these three principles forms the essential structure of human existence. Salt without sulfur becomes dead matter, mere mechanical existence without purpose or passion. Sulfur without salt becomes dissipated energy, formless enthusiasm that accomplishes nothing. Mercury without both salt and sulfur has nothing to mediate, no work to perform. The three must exist in dynamic relationship, each constraining and enabling the others. This triadic structure finds profound correspondence with other esoteric systems. In Kabbalah, the three pillars of the tree of life, severity, mercy, and balance, mirror the structure of salt, sulfur, and mercury. The Neoplatonic triad of the One, the intellect, and the soul represents the same fundamental architecture viewed from a different philosophical angle. Even in Eastern traditions, the Hindu Trimurti of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, creation, preservation, destruction, expresses a similar recognition of threefold necessity. What distinguishes the trinosophic approach is its insistence on practical application rather than mere theoretical understanding. The Rosicrucian tradition emphasized that knowledge of these principles must be accompanied by direct experience of them within one's own being. This requires what the occultist Dion Fortune called trained imagination, the capacity to hold symbolic structures in consciousness while simultaneously observing their manifestation in psychological reality. The mentality required of the authentic adept combines three qualities that mirror the structure itself. First, there must be discipline, the capacity to endure the fixation of salt, to commit to sustained practice rather than fleeting enthusiasm. Second, there must be passion, the combustible intensity of sulfur, the genuine desire for transformation rather than mere intellectual curiosity. Third, there must be intelligence, the mercurial fluidity to observe, analyze, and integrate the process as it unfolds. The ethical dimension of trinosophy cannot be overlooked. The occult tradition has always insisted that power without ethics is black magic. Transformation without wisdom is catastrophe. The adept must approach the work with what Aleister Crowley called true will, not the whims of ego, but the deeper purpose aligned with one's authentic nature. This ethical foundation prevents the work from degenerating into narcissistic self-absorption or manipulative power-seeking. Crucial to this work is the disposition toward doubt, not the corrosive skepticism that denies all possibility, but the philosophical doubt that tests all claims against direct experience. The traditions of Hermeticism and alchemy have always been deeply empirical in their own way, demanding that practitioners verify principles through lived experience rather than accepting them on authority. This experimental attitude distinguishes authentic esotericism from religious dogmatism or New Age credulity. The transformation of consciousness according to trinosophic principles unfolds through a precise sequence of stages, each building upon the previous, each requiring specific psychological operations. This is not a linear progression, but a spiral, returning again and again to fundamental challenges at ever deeper levels. The alchemical tradition codified this process in the sequence of Nigredo, Albedo, and Rubedo, blackening, whitening, and reddening, which corresponds to the psychological journey of confrontation, purification, and integration. The initial stage begins with what appears as darkness, dissolution, and death. Psychologically, this corresponds to the confrontation with everything within oneself that has been denied, repressed, or projected onto others. Jung called this encounter with the shadow, the sum total of qualities, impulses, and potentials that consciousness has rejected as incompatible with the ego's self-image. In trinosophic terms, the Nigredo represents the necessary breakdown of the false unity maintained by the ego. The salt of habitual identity must be broken down, dissolved, decomposed. This is not metaphorical. The practitioner experiences genuine psychological death, the collapse of cherished self-concepts, the revelation of previously hidden motivations, the recognition of one's capacity for cruelty, cowardice, and deception. The operation of Nigredo involves several specific processes. Calcination, the first alchemical operation, burns away superficial attachments and false securities. In psychological terms, this manifests as crisis, the loss of status, relationship, or certainty that forces consciousness to question its foundations. The practitioner must endure this burning without fleeing into distraction or premature consolation. Following calcination comes dissolution, the liquefaction of rigid structures. Psychologically, this involves allowing repressed emotions to surface and be felt fully. The carefully constructed dams of psychological defense are opened, and the practitioner must allow themselves to be flooded by previously rejected feelings: grief, rage, shame, terror. This is extraordinarily difficult, as the ego fears annihilation in this emotional deluge. Separation, the third operation within Nigredo, involves the careful discrimination of what is essential from what is accidental in one's identity. Not everything discovered in the shadow must be integrated. Some contents represent genuine pathology or cultural conditioning that should be released. The practitioner must develop the mercurial capacity to observe without identification, to separate authentic nature from imposed overlay. Throughout the Nigredo, the practitioner encounters the darkest aspects of human nature, not only personal shadow, but what Jung called the collective unconscious, the archetypal structures of violence, domination, and destruction that humanity carries. This is where many seekers fail, retreating into premature spiritualization or intellectual bypass. The Nigredo demands absolute honesty and the courage to remain present with what is discovered. Having survived the dissolution of the Nigredo, consciousness enters the phase of Albedo, characterized by clarification, purification, and the emergence of a new quality of awareness. If Nigredo was descensus ad inferos, descent into hell, then Albedo is the gradual return to light, but a light now earned through intimate knowledge of darkness. The primary operation of Albedo is conjunction, the beginning of integration between previously separated elements. Psychologically, this manifests as the capacity to hold opposites in consciousness without splitting into one-sided identifications. The ego learns to contain both strength and vulnerability, both masculine and feminine qualities, both shadow and light. In trinosophic terms, the albedo represents the beginning of authentic Mercury, the emergence of reflective consciousness that can observe and mediate between the other principles. The practitioner develops what the Buddhists call witness consciousness, the capacity to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being captured by them. This is not dissociation, but a more inclusive form of awareness. The albedo also involves the operation of fermentation, the introduction of a new animating principle into the purified substance. Psychologically, this corresponds to what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to generate new symbols and meanings that transcend previous limitations. The practitioner begins to experience moments of genuine insight, spontaneous images, and dreams of unusual clarity and numinosity. During albedo, the relationship with the self begins to establish itself. In Jungian terms, the self represents the totality of consciousness and unconsciousness, the organizing principle that transcends ego. The ego, having been broken down in the Nigredo, now begins to recognize its true position as servant rather than master, as organ of consciousness rather than totality of identity. The practitioner in albedo experiences what might be called clarification of vision. Perception becomes cleaner, less distorted by projection and transference. Relationships begin to change as the practitioner stops demanding that others carry their projections. A quality of objectivity emerges, not the cold objectivity of scientific detachment, but the warm objectivity of genuine seeing. However, albedo also carries its own dangers. The relief of emerging from the Nigredo can lead to premature satisfaction, the belief that the work is complete. Many spiritual practitioners become arrested at this stage, cultivating a sterile purity that lacks the fullness of embodied humanity. The white stage must give way to the red if transformation is to be complete. The final stage, Rubedo, represents the achievement of the philosopher's stone, the integration of all principles into a unified whole. This is not a return to original innocence, but the establishment of a higher unity that incorporates and transcends everything learned in the previous stages. The color red symbolizes blood, life, passion, the return of sulfur, but now integrated with the clarity of mercury and the stability of salt. The primary operation of Rubedo is coagulation, the fixation of the volatile mercury into stable form. Psychologically, this corresponds to the establishment of what Jung called the individuated personality, a consciousness that has integrated shadow and anima animus, that has established genuine relationship with the self. In trinosophic terms, the three principles achieve dynamic equilibrium. Salt no longer represents dead fixation but stable foundation. Sulfur no longer represents destructive combustion but passionate engagement. Mercury no longer represents elusive fluidity but living intelligence. The three work together in creative synthesis. The practitioner in Rubedo embodies what the alchemists called the union of opposites, not their abolition, but their productive tension. This person can hold contradiction without collapse, can embrace complexity without fragmentation. They have achieved what the Hermetic tradition calls the reconciliation of all dualities, not through elimination, but through integration. Rubedo also involves the operation of what some traditions call multiplication or projection, the capacity to transmit the transformative power to others. The individuated person becomes, in a sense, an alchemical catalyst, someone whose presence facilitates transformation in others. This is not through teaching or manipulation, but through being. The embodiment of integrated consciousness naturally awakens similar potential in those who encounter it. The psychological hallmark of Rubedo is what Jung called active imagination, the capacity to engage consciously with unconscious contents in a way that is neither inflation nor repression. The practitioner can enter symbolic realms while maintaining ego stability, can dialogue with archetypal energies without being possessed by them. The red work represents the completion of one cycle and the beginning of another at a higher level. The alchemical tradition recognized that the great work is never truly finished. Each achievement becomes the foundation for further transformation. The difference is that the practitioner in Rubedo approaches subsequent cycles with wisdom earned through experience rather than naive enthusiasm. Within the threefold journey, there exists a moment of supreme testing, a threshold that cannot be bypassed or negotiated. This is what the mystical tradition calls the dark night of the soul, what alchemy represents as the deepest phase of Nigredo, what psychology recognizes as the archetypal crisis of meaning. This encounter with existential despair stands as the necessary crucible through which authentic transformation must pass. The crisis typically emerges at the moment when the practitioner has committed fully to the work, has invested significant energy and identity in the transformative process, and then encounters the apparent failure or futility of all efforts. The practices that once brought insight now seem mechanical. The symbols that once burned with meaning now appear hollow. The sense of progress evaporates, replaced by a terrible recognition. Perhaps the entire enterprise has been an elaborate self-deception, a psychological defense against the stark meaninglessness of existence. Psychologically, this crisis represents what Jung called the confrontation with the self in its aspect of death. The ego, which has survived the initial dissolution of the Nigredo, now faces an even more profound challenge, the recognition that even its reformed, more conscious version must die. The practitioner discovers that the attachment to spiritual identity, to being one who is transforming, is itself the final and most subtle obstacle. This is qualitatively different from ordinary depression or existential anxiety. The mundane crisis of meaning can often be resolved through distraction, achievement, or relationship. The esoteric crisis occurs precisely when all these ordinary solutions have been exhausted and found wanting. The practitioner has already seen through the illusions that satisfy most people. They cannot return to comfortable unconsciousness even if they wish to. The experience manifests with devastating phenomenological intensity. There is a sense of absolute isolation, as though one exists in a universe utterly indifferent to human meaning or value. The practices and disciplines that once structured daily life now seem not merely useless, but actively foolish, the preoccupations of someone deeply self-deceived. Every spiritual experience of the past appears suspect, possibly mere psychological phenomena without transcendent significance. What makes this crisis necessary rather than pathological is its teleological function, its purposiveness within the larger process of transformation. The ego must confront the possibility of its absolute failure, not as punishment, but as the final test of commitment. Is the practitioner pursuing transformation because it produces pleasant experiences and a sense of spiritual specialness, or are they capable of continuing even when all rewards and assurances have been withdrawn? The philosophical distinction between esoteric crisis and clinical pathology lies in the presence or absence of this teleological dimension. Depression, in the clinical sense, tends toward entropy, toward the gradual diminishment of vitality and engagement. The dark night, by contrast, maintains an uncanny intensity even in its darkness. There is suffering, yes, but not the flat numbness of true depressive disorder. There is despair, but of a quality that remains strangely awake and aware. The alchemical tradition understood this stage as the moment of greatest danger and greatest potential. It is here that the prima materia, the raw substance of the psyche, achieves its most complete dissolution. Everything that can be burned away has been burned away. What remains is either the authentic core of being or nothing at all. The practitioner cannot know which until they have endured to the end of the process. During this phase, all the psychological defense mechanisms that usually protect consciousness from overwhelming anxiety are stripped away. The practitioner experiences what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death, not physical death, but the death of all meaning structures that make life bearable. This is the ground zero of consciousness, the point at which existence itself becomes questionable. The temptations at this stage are manifold. There is the temptation to flee back into unconsciousness, to declare the entire esoteric enterprise a mistake and return to ordinary life. There is the temptation toward spiritual bypassing, to leap over the darkness through premature affirmation or forced positive thinking. There is the temptation toward nihilistic despair, to conclude that meaninglessness is the final truth and abandon the work entirely. The authentic response requires something the tradition calls faithfulness in the void, the capacity to remain committed to the process even when all evidence suggests futility. This is not faith in the religious sense of believing propositions. It is the existential capacity to continue operating according to one's highest understanding, even when that understanding has lost its emotional charge and intuitive certainty. What distinguishes this esoteric suffering from mere masochism or pathology is the presence of what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. The practitioner in the dark night does not seek suffering for its own sake, but recognizes its necessity within the logic of transformation. There is a strange acceptance, almost a collaboration, with the process that is destroying them. They understand, even if only dimly, that what is dying needs to die. The resolution of this crisis, when it comes, arrives not through effort, but through surrender. The practitioner reaches a point of absolute exhaustion, where all striving ceases not because they have given up, but because they have finally released the demand that reality conform to their expectations. In that moment of total surrender, something unprecedented emerges. Not the ego's resurrection, but the recognition of something that was never born and can never die. The culmination of the trinosophic journey results in what the tradition calls the philosopher's stone, not a physical object, but a transformed state of consciousness, a new mode of being in the world. This achievement represents not an endpoint, but a stable foundation from which further development becomes possible. The integrated individual has established what Jung called the ego-self axis, a conscious relationship between the center of ordinary awareness and the deeper organizing principle of the psyche. The hallmarks of this integrated consciousness are distinctive and recognizable. First, there is a quality of genuine individuality, not egoic specialness, but authentic particularity. The person has differentiated themselves from collective identifications, from the unconscious assumptions and values of their culture, while simultaneously recognizing their essential participation in the human condition. They are neither dissolved into collective conformity nor inflated into isolated uniqueness. Second, the integrated individual exhibits what the tradition calls philosophical equilibrium, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension without collapsing into one-sided positions. They can embrace both discipline and spontaneity, both skepticism and wonder, both detachment and engagement. This is not bland-centeredness, but dynamic balance, the continuous adjustment of consciousness to maintain stability while remaining responsive to changing circumstances. Third, there emerges a quality of what might be called ethical lucidity. The person who has completed the alchemical work no longer requires external rules or commandments to guide action. Their behavior flows from direct perception of what each situation requires. This is not moral relativism, but something closer to what Aristotle called phronesis, practical wisdom that perceives the good in concrete circumstances rather than abstract principles. The relationship to desire and passion undergoes fundamental transformation. The sulfur principle, which began as unconscious compulsion and reactive emotion, becomes what the magical tradition calls true will. Desire aligned with authentic nature rather than conditioned response. The integrated person acts with passion, but not from passion. Their enthusiasm serves chosen purposes rather than controlling them. Similarly, the relationship to body and material existence, the salt principle, achieves new quality. The body is no longer experienced as prison or obstacle, but as the necessary ground of consciousness, the vehicle through which spirit manifests in material form. There is care for physical health not from vanity or fear, but from recognition that embodiment matters. The Gnostic denigration of matter gives way to Hermetic appreciation of the body as temple. The Mercury principle, consciousness itself, becomes both more stable and more flexible. The integrated individual has developed what meditation traditions call continuous awareness, the capacity to maintain observing consciousness throughout varied activities and states. This is not the forced effort of beginners, but a natural quality of being that has become second nature through long practice. Practically, this transformed consciousness manifests in several concrete ways. First, the person becomes remarkably resistant to psychological manipulation and mass hysteria. Having confronted their own shadow extensively, they recognize it in others and in collective movements. They can observe propaganda, ideology, and groupthink without being captured by them. Second, the integrated individual demonstrates unusual resilience in the face of adversity. Having survived the dark night of the soul, ordinary difficulties appear manageable. They have discovered resources within themselves that remain available even when external circumstances collapse. This is not invulnerability, but a grounded confidence earned through ordeal. Third, there emerges a natural quality of leadership, not the domination of others, but the capacity to hold steady while those around panic. The integrated person becomes what the alchemists called a philosopher by fire, someone whose presence provides orientation and stability for others. This is not intentional or performed, but an organic result of having established genuine center. The ethical responsibilities accompanying this achievement cannot be overstated. The esoteric traditions have always warned against the corruption of power, the possibility that one who has gained genuine knowledge might use it for manipulation or exploitation. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, cuts both ways. The person capable of profound self-transformation wields corresponding power to influence others, and this power must be exercised with utmost care. This is why the Hermetic school emphasizes ethical formation alongside technical training. The adept must develop not only capacity but character, not only knowledge but wisdom. They must recognize that every increase in power multiplies moral responsibility. The person who can read unconscious motivations in others bears the burden of never using this capacity for advantage. The person who has transcended ordinary fears carries the obligation to act with courage on behalf of those still bound by them. The integrated individual also recognizes the limits of what has been achieved. The philosopher's stone is not omnipotence or omniscience. It represents a stabilized stage of human development, not the totality of possible evolution. There remains mystery, uncertainty, and the unknown. The difference is that these are met now with curiosity rather than anxiety, with openness rather than defensive certainty. Finally, the person who has completed the great work discovers that achievement brings not rest but new responsibility. They cannot simply enjoy their transformation in private retreat. The nature of the work itself demands that its benefits flow outward. This is not evangelism or proselytizing, but the natural consequence of genuine transformation. Consciousness that has integrated darkness and light, death and life, becomes a transmitter of possibility for others. The Hermetic school exists precisely to facilitate this work with rigor and honesty, to preserve the authentic teachings while adapting them to contemporary understanding. The discipline required, the study, practice, and self-examination, mirrors the threefold structure itself. Knowledge provides the salt of foundation, passion provides the sulfur of motivation, and practice provides the mercury of integration. Without all three, maintained in continuous balance, the work degenerates into mere scholarship, emotional enthusiasm, or mechanical ritual. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the flame.